Hey, good morning, folks. Um, well, let's get right to it. I think this is the slide we finished up on yesterday, and I know I sort of was rushing through, but just those couple of incidences in Cuba, just with Cuba becoming communist, and then the Bay of Pigs fiasco and the Cuban Missile Crisis, all in the early '60s with JFK and at least the fiascos. Um, sort of set this tension. And I mentioned yesterday that the way Khrushchev sort of handled this and ended up having to back down from putting missiles in Cuba sort of lost him his job, and he was replaced as premier of the Soviet Union shortly thereafter by Leonid Brezhnev. And Brezhnev was much more of a hardliner, so things got a little bit, in some ways, a little more tense, even still in the 60s. Um, by the way, our little thing for the day, this date in 1961, so also another Cold War kind of thing. The American space race was all about the Cold War. Alan Shepard became the first American to go into space. Uh, Obviously, Neil Armstrong walked on the moon in '69, but Shepard was the first American to go into space. All right. Anyway, so I'm going to try to keep you short today. So move along here. I know you'll have to pause for the notes part, but hopefully you listen as well. Um, so Central America, here in America's is part of North America. You have the Central American countries of Guatemala and Belize and Costa Rica, Panama, Nicaragua, Honduras. So there have been a lot of incidences in Central American history that the United States has been involved in. Um, it has long been policy of the United States that Central America was more our issue than European issue, and we sort of took it on as our kind of. We tried to keep Europe out of it. Basically, is what I'm saying. And way back around that time when we were doing all those independence movements in South America and Central America, well, that's sort of when it started. When they sort of got rid of their connections to Europe, then America tried to step in and claim it as our own in our own little way, not always for their interest but our interest. Anyway, um, there was fighting going on in Nicaragua in the 60s and 70s. There was a long dictatorship, that had gone back for years. This was now into the 70s that we were supporting this not so great dictator, not a democracy, but a dictator. But the dictator was friendly to the United States and therefore gave us, things that we wanted. Uh, and eventually you have this kind of financial aid issue that we see going on throughout the Cold War, U.S. giving aid to one side, USSR giving to the other side. Um, and there was a communist leader who did win some elections, and Daniel Ortega. Um, but overall, it didn't become a Soviet-like communist state. It wasn't like Cuba, uh, but there was this constant going back and forth between the communist side and the not communist side, and um, we just sort of the battles were going on. Um, in the Middle East, um, we had the same kind of thing going on. Israel was created. There was no Jewish homeland anywhere in the world um, until after World War II, and since many years in the past. But after World War II, um, the European powers, the American powers, the Allied powers that won the war carved out Israel in the Middle East and made it a homeland for Jews. Now, of course, that made a lot of Muslims and a lot of Middle Eastern peoples angry. Certainly, they had to take somebody's land for that. Um, and it has led to a lot of tensions over the last 50 years, 60 years now. Uh, and this was part of what was going on during the Cold War. So Israel was backed, still is backed by the United States. USR started taking the side of some of their enemies in the area. Egypt, a neighbor to the south west, was backed financially in many ways by the USSR, Soviet Union, um, and it became such an important area because of the rise in the power of oil. And so um, it became quite the issue. And I just noticed a typo. It should be led to more active involvement. And you'll see this, you've seen this throughout history. We're not going to get into a lot of the conflicts here, but that's just sort of, a lot of the tensions that have been created in the Middle East have to do with one, Israel's presence there, and two, um, with the Cold War tensions of the Soviet Union and the United States and who we backed and who they backed. And three, the importance of oil. As it's increased importance, that has become more desirable to anyone else in the world. And when you want something, that's when you fight over it. I'm looking at this map now, and I apologize, it's so blurry. But I just wanted you to see Israel is right here. Egypt to the southwest. This Sinai Peninsula is a much battled over piece of land between Egypt and Israel. You have Jordan and Syria. There were issues in Turkey with the Soviet Union wanting this access again. We've seen the Caspian Sea, and up here is where, or we've seen the Black Sea, and up here is where Crimea is, and that was long been and still is, if you remember from your IXLs. This week, you'll see Crimea still being a debated topic between Ukraine and Russia as to who owns it. Anyway, we're going to see issues in Iran where Soviet Union wants access, so there are issues there between Iran and Britain. The Iraq War between Iran and Iraq for 8 years in the 80s. Right next to it off the map here is where Afghanistan is, and then Pakistan to the south. And we're going to hear about some Afghani issues too. So just to give you a sense again. All right, Iran became a hotspot in the 70s. So there was this longtime dictator of Iran. He has a name, but most people don't remember that name. He's known as the Shah of Iran. It's sort of like the president of Iran. The Shah is a title. And in 1970, he had been backed by the United States because he was friendly to the United States. He was not a good leader, but again, he was friendly to us and the governments. We put up with that. There was a Muslim movement to overthrow the Shah. And another typo, sorry about that. And so this Muslim group wanted to overthrow the Shah, and they did. And he was elderly and apparently sick, and he needed, I think it was kidney treatment. And the American government, under Jimmy Carter, the president in the late 70s, allowed him to come to America for treatment. Well, the Ayatollah Khomeini, Ayatollah being the title and Khomeini is his last name, Ayatollah Khomeini was the new Muslim leader, and he was not happy with that. They demanded the Shah's return. They wanted to punish him for the crimes that he had committed against the people, and the U.S. refused, and it became a big issue. At that point, Khomeini's followers, they took over the U.S. embassy. So they charged it, they climbed the walls, they infiltrated the embassy, and there were about 60 members of the diplomatic community and Americans who were in the embassy, and they were held hostage for over a year, 444 days. This new government ended up going to war with Iraq for the next 8 years throughout the 80s. And that hostage situation was probably the end of Jimmy Carter's presidencies for sure. There were lots of problems with his presidency. But at the end of his term, he couldn't get the people home. They wouldn't deal with him. He tried a military invasion, and it failed in before it even got there. The planes couldn't, or the helicopters they used had problems in the desert, and the dust got into it, and it was one of the helicopters went down uh, because of that. They never even engaged in the Irani leadership that was there, and then didn't take until it took until the end of the sorry, it took until Reagan was elected. Ronald Reagan became the next president, and basically they agreed that as soon as Reagan took office, they would return the hostages, which they did. Um, Afghanistan, again, I pointed that out on the map, was invaded by the Soviet Union in '79. Uh, the Muslim group was threatening to take over, and so the USSR invaded Afghanistan to sort of fill the void of the power that was going on in 1979. The ironic part of this is that on this occasion, the United States, just to fight communism, aided the Muslim fighters that were trying to take over. So it wasn't about a religious issues per se. It was like whoever was against the communists, that's who the Americans would support, or whoever was against democracy or capitalism, that's who the Soviets would support. So you got into a league with people that you had not necessarily any other issues that you agreed with them on. So these radical fighters were just fighting against Soviet Union, and so the U.S. backed them. And the irony here is that Osama bin Laden, the man who's behind the bombing of the World Trade Center, the 2001, issues, he was one of the leaders of these Afghani fighters, and the United States was giving them money and supporting them, and was in league with Osama bin Laden in 1979 in Afghanistan. Anyway, this invasion led to huge boycotts around the world. Europe, America boycotted things about the Soviet Union because we were mad at them for invading Afghanistan. And again, Jimmy Carter, when the 1980 Olympics rolled around that were supposed to be held in Moscow in the Soviet Union, he ended up boycotting them for the United States. So the United States did not participate in the 1980 Olympics that were held in the Soviet Union. Again, Cold War issues affecting real people. All right, we're closing in here on the end. The Cold War starting to slow down a little bit and thaw in the 80s and near the end of the 80s especially. We had mentioned that Khrushchev lost power because of the Cuban Missile Crisis and was replaced with Brezhnev. And in the 60s and 70s, Brezhnev was putting down anti-communist movements all over in the Eastern Bloc. He was pretty brutal about how he did it in Czechoslovakia. But we were starting to see some of those countries in the Eastern Bloc move away, or at least try to move away from the Soviet Union's control. China and Russia, who had joined together as these two communist countries, they didn't really see eye to eye. They had a different view on how communism should be enacted. They had a different view on who should be the more powerful country, and they sort of squabbled and they separated. So the Sino-Soviet break started to tear at this communism, the monolith and all-powerful idea a little bit. And so their treaty ended. I say they've split. Their treaty ended. They were never together as one government. In '68, we see Nixon being elected, and that did change things a little bit. Now, he was a hardline kind of guy, but he did end the Vietnam War and reduce our involvement there. As we had said, he pulled troops from Vietnam and ended up ending that war. He did visit China and the Soviet Union after years of not even recognizing China. The U.S. government refused to recognize China as a country for a while. It was weird, but again, Cold War kind of attitudes. He visited the Soviet Union, and he led talks that started the first strategic arms limitation talks and a treaty. Again, you'll have to pause. This is the last slide that you'll probably have to just write some of the ideas down on. So thanks, guys.